Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the FTS webinar for Human Trafficking Awareness Month. We're going to just pause for a second here while we wait for people to join us and get settled, and then we will start the presentation. Thank you. All right. Again, welcome. Let's get started. My name is Brian Lippincott. I'm the head of communications and digital engagement at Free the Slaves, and it is my privilege to welcome you this morning to this webinar on human trafficking as part of our awareness efforts for Human Trafficking Awareness Month. Today, I'm joined by a number of my Free the Slaves colleagues. I'll introduce them briefly now and a little bit more in depth later in the webinar. Dr. Giselle Balfour is the head of programs at Free the Slaves. Hema Bahardi is the regional manager for Latin America and Europe. Jacqueline Mwende is the senior regional manager for East and Central Africa and our survivor engagement lead. Kuldeep Chauhan is our regional director for Southeast Asia. Isa Saka is the regional director for West Africa. And Rasha Almanha is the regional manager for the Middle East and North Africa region. Adrian Alexander is the advocacy and movement building manager for Trinidad and Tobago. And Dr. Marta Furlan is our research officer. Today, I want to start our time by providing a brief background on Free the Slaves, our history, and our mission. Founded in 2000, Free the Slaves has established itself as a leader and pioneer in the modern abolitionist movement, awakening the world to the enduring problem of slavery and crafting a global blueprint for change. Over the years, we have successfully collaborated with governments, international institutions, faith communities, businesses, and the public to inform and implement strategies against modern slavery. From the very beginning, we have utilized community-based solutions to address modern slavery, human trafficking, forced labor, and child labor in communities around the world. These efforts have culminated in the liberation of more than 16,000 individuals from slavery and the education of more than 760,000 community members on prevention techniques. At this point, we're going to turn our attention to a discussion of human trafficking, what it is, its different forms, root causes, and the scale of the problem. So I'll pass the microphone to our research officer, Dr. Marta Furlan, who manages the design, execution, and reporting for all of our research projects. A quick reminder, if you have a question at any point during the presentation, please add it to the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be sure to answer it at the scheduled Q&A time at the end of the webinar. Marta, over to you.
Thank you so much, Brian, and welcome everyone to this Free the Slaves webinar. As Brian anticipated, I'm going to use the time available for my intervention to share a bit about what is human trafficking. Since we are in the Prevention Month on human trafficking, I think it's appropriate to kind of unpack this very complex concept and shed a light on it. So allow me to share my screen. Can you see it? Perfect. So let's get started. What is human trafficking? Before looking into the definition, I think it's important to have two considerations in mind. First, human trafficking is a complex phenomenon. It's an umbrella term that comprises many different realities of exploitation, and we will see them later in this presentation. At the same time, human trafficking is a dynamic phenomenon. As our societies continuously evolve, so does human trafficking. I think We can take as example the online sexual exploitation of children. As digital technologies are becoming more and more prominent in our lives, so traffickers are also using them. And one of the forms of trafficking that is dramatically becoming more and more widespread is the sexual exploitation of children online. Now, let's unpack the definition of human trafficking. And here I'm referring to the Palermo Protocol, or the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in person. I'm using this definition because this is the one that is internationally accepted, and it served as a foundation for the definitions that then have been adopted by countries in their national legislations. So human trafficking, as we said, is an umbrella term, comprises three main elements: act, means, and purpose. Let's look into them. Act is what the traffickers do, and they can recruit, transport, transfer, harbor, or receive a victim of trafficking. The means is the means that they use to engage in this act. It can be threat or use of force, coercion, fraud, deception, abuse of their own power, or abuse of the victim's vulnerability, giving payments, giving benefits, and even abductions. And the purpose, the reason why they do so, is exploitation. And this is, I believe, the key word to understanding human trafficking. Also, a point that I want to make in this regard is that oftentimes there is a in the case of human trafficking, the key word is exploitation. And another clarification that is important to make is that the case of children is a specific one because of their unique vulnerability. In the case of children, we don't need the means for human trafficking to occur. So when there is an act, recruitment, transportation, transferring of children for a purpose of exploitation, regardless of the means used, this is enough for the situation to be considered human trafficking. Now, let's look a bit deeper into these elements that we have pointed out. Who are the victims? Victims of human trafficking can be anyone. However, traffickers typically prey upon vulnerable people. So they can be orphan children, unaccompanied children, illegal migrants, members of ethnic and linguistic minorities, refugees, and people with disabilities. For instance, in a research project that we did at Free the Slaves, and that we will see more detail later on today, in the Peruvian Amazon region, we found that indigenous people are especially vulnerable to the risk of exploitation. In another project that we did in the Horn of Africa, we found that here it is illegal migrants trying to cross borders illegally beyond the legal framework available that are especially vulnerable to being exploited. What are the vulnerabilities? Typical vulnerabilities exploited by traffickers include poverty, lack of lawful immigration status, lack of education, marginalization, exposure to conflict, lack of identity documents. And I think here what is interesting to note is that some of these vulnerabilities are vulnerabilities that a person is born with, for instance, disabilities or belonging to an ethnic minorities, while other sources of vulnerabilities might emerge later on in life, for instance, being exposed to a conflict. And this is important to understand better what we were saying before, that anyone can become a victim of human trafficking. When it comes to location, so victims can be found in factories, farms, plantations, fishing vessels, restaurants, hotels, so really any sector of the economy can be implicated in human trafficking. However, it is fair to say that informal sectors of the economy, where it is harder for the enforcement arm of the state to reach, are more likely to be affected by human trafficking. Now let's look at the traffickers. Who are the traffickers? Again, just as victims can be anyone, then traffickers also can be anyone. They can be family members, partners, acquaintances, strangers. They can act alone or they can be part of a criminal group. They can be pimps, gang members, business owners, job recruiters, or the owners of factory companies, plantations, and farms. For instance, a research that we did in the Philippines last year, and again, we will have a chance to discuss this in more depth later on, found that traffickers in some of the communities where we did the research were the parents of the children, or traffickers, but even employers. So there was a great diversity in terms of the profile of the traffickers in the Philippines communities. Now, we said before that human trafficking is an umbrella term, that many different forms of exploitation are included within it. And we find, in fact, sexual exploitation, forced labor, debt bondage, domestic servitude, organ trafficking, forced begging, child soldier, and forced marriage. And now we will look at each of them in a bit more detail. Forced labor. So forced labor is work or service that is exacted from a person under the threat of penalty and for which the person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. In the case of children, forced labor is work that the child performs for a third party or for the parents under threat, in a situation in which one or both parents are in forced labor themselves, or in one of the worst forms of child labor, including sale and trafficking, debt bondage, serfdom, recruitment in conflict, prostitution, pornography, and illicit activities. Sex trafficking is when a person is recruited, harbored, transported, or received for the purpose of a commercial sexual act, in which the person is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or the person is under 18 years old. We said before that the means is not a requirement for the trafficking of children to be observed. Then we have domestic servitude, which is a very common form of exploitation that I believe we don't often talk enough about. And it's observed when a domestic worker finds himself or herself in these circumstances: not free to leave the employment, underpaid or not paid at all, basic rights such as free time, social protection, healthcare are denied, identity documents are withheld, the person is prevented from moving freely, is exposed within the house of the employer to abuse, harassment, and exploitation, including sexual exploitation. This is a form of trafficking that is often observed among migrant women and migrant girls that leave their own country and go abroad to engage in domestic work and then find themselves in these situations of exploitation. Then we have debt bondage, which is a form of trafficking widely observed in South Asia, whereby a person is under debt or bond and is forced to provide labor to the person that borrowed the money without being paid or being paid a minimal amount of money, often with the debt actually growing in time and living and working in harsh conditions. And it is interesting and dramatic to note that this form of trafficking can be intergenerational. A person can actually born in debt bondage, being forced to work to pay off the debt that was actually contracted by his or parents or even grandparents. Forced marriage is when a person, one or both persons, party to the marriage do not or cannot consent to the marriage. And while this form of human trafficking is certainly more common among girls and women, we should not forget that boys and men as well can be victims of forced marriage. Then we have organ removal, when a person is trafficked to be exploited for his or her bodily organs. This is a dramatic form of exploitation. Well, actually, all of them are, but the most common organs sought in this case are kidneys and livers that are very in high request in the organ market for purposes of transplantation. Now that we have covered all these diverse forms of human trafficking, where is human trafficking observed? Human trafficking is clearly a global phenomenon, but certain countries and certain regions are more affected than others. Now, here I'm using the beautiful picture of the Global Slavery Index in the latest report that they published. We see that 50 million people as of today are living in situations of modern slavery, human trafficking. Since 2018, that was the date when the last index was released, there has been an increase of 10 million people, which is dramatic. We are thinking we are making progress, and then the numbers are proving the opposite. And of course, if we look at the dates, an event such as the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 certainly played a role. But this is a signal that we're not doing enough. Of these 50 million people, 28 are exploited in forced labor, 22 million in forced marriage. And when it comes to the profile of the victim, over 50% are female, 25%, 1/4 are children. Migrants are 3 times more likely to be in forced labor. And then, as we said at the beginning, other groups of people that are more exposed to the risk of being trafficked, of being exploited, include indigenous people, ethnic minorities, people with disabilities, or people that are falling in the LGBTQI plus group. If we look at the countries we see that the 10 countries where there is the highest prevalence of human trafficking are North Korea, Eritrea, Mauritania, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Tajikistan, United Arab Emirates, Russia, Afghanistan, and Kuwait. Now, of course, because human trafficking is a global phenomenon, but it is very context specific when it comes to the drivers and the manifestations. To understand in detail why these countries have such a high prevalence of modern slavery, we should be looking at the reality of these countries. We should be doing research into the context that these countries are facing. But some considerations that we can make are that these countries are affected by modern slavery and human trafficking because of a lack of civil liberties, human rights abuses, gender and racial discrimination, conflict, corruption, and harmful cultural norms that facilitate and perpetuate human trafficking. While on the other hand, we see that on the lowest side of the human trafficking prevalence, we have countries such as Switzerland, Norway, Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, Belgium, Ireland, Japan, and Finland. So countries where the rule of law is significantly better protected, countries with less discrimination, less human rights abuses, no conflicts, and less harmful cultural norms dominating dynamics within the society. So I know that it was a lot to go through in just 10 minutes, but we can have a question and answer session later if there is something that you would like to ask about or to discuss a bit more in depth. And for the moment, I will give it back to my colleague, Brian.
Brian, you are on mute.
Thank you, Adrian. Sorry about that. So thank you, Marta, for the background on human trafficking, for the different types of trafficking and exploitation that occur around the world. While it is important to understand what trafficking is, it is also equally important to understand how trafficking affects victims and survivors. So I want to invite Dr. Giselle Balfour, our head of programs, to share more about how trafficking affects survivors. And again, you can add any questions that come up to the Q&A section in Zoom, and we'll do our best to answer them after the presentations. Giselle?
Thank you very much, Brian. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Brian is going to be my assistant today, helping me share my PowerPoint.
Oh, hold on. There we go.
Fantastic. Thank you so very much. So as Brian said, we will be exploring the specific impact of human trafficking on the survivors, the victims of human trafficking. That's not to say that trafficking doesn't have an impact on our societies, our communities in a number of ways. But today we're going to focus on the survivors and these lovely faces. You'll hear a bit more about them as we go later on. But Brian, if you can go to the next slide. Okay, so human trafficking strips away the personal autonomy in the lives of its victims. Victims experience many indignities throughout the course of their trafficking experience, which for many has led to a host of significant, long-lasting consequences. We must acknowledge before I move forward that trafficking experiences differ from one person to the next, and there are a host of factors that impact how these experiences may affect each individual. So there are things like the length and severity of the trafficking experience, the trauma that they may have experienced prior to being trafficked, their support systems, things like that impact how they will experience trafficking. However, an extensive review of the research on the impact of human trafficking revealed that there are a number of areas where there's some commonalities for survivors of trafficking. So the next slide, please, Brian. So one of the biggest impacts we see is on the health of survivors. And we're going to look at health in two ways. So mental health as well as physical health. So one of the ones that we hear about most often is the impact of on the mental health of survivors of trafficking. Findings from studies reveal that many survivors of human trafficking report experiences of anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, lack of emotional regulation, paranoia, and symptoms of PTSD. Now, remember, I just spoke about the factors that can exacerbate or worsen the impact of trafficking, one's experience of trafficking. Well, this is often where those factors play a major role. Persons may have endured brutality while being trafficked, those who were in trafficking for an extended period of time, and those who may have had other traumatic experiences prior to being trafficked. They often experience what we call complex trauma. And I can give you an example. I worked previously with teens who were survivors of commercial sexual exploitation. And here in the US, our research shows that about 80% of victims of commercial sexual exploitation of children will experience child sexual abuse prior to being sexually exploited. So that means that they had severe trauma on top of severe trauma. And that's what we call complex trauma. Complex trauma is believed to be the result of repeated and prolonged exposure to trauma, to traumatic events such as physical, sexual, and psychological abuse, entrapment, and exposure to the abuse of others. All of these are common experiences for some trafficking victims. However, regardless of whether one's trauma experience is complex or not, if left untreated, which is the reality for many survivors who lack the necessary resources to access intensive trauma-focused therapy, these issues can lead to a host of behavioral issues such as substance use disorders, violent outbursts, right? So when I worked with the teens previously who were survivors of commercial sexual exploitation, many of them had issues with running away. They had a hard time being focused in schools. They had a hard time, they were combative. Some of them even engaged in self-harming behaviors. And so we can see how the mental health aspect of trafficking can build up. And one of the ways that we often talk about that often goes unnoticed is that the loss of one's sense of self. This is the feeling that you don't know who you are anymore. Sometimes survivors have trouble constructing their own identities, which is worsened because of their isolation and rejection. According to one study that I read, human trafficking disrupts our previously known roles and personhood. So due to trauma experience and the uncertainty of the living situations while being trafficked, survivors often navigate a process of reconstructing their sense of self and exhibiting coping strategies to resituate their understanding of themselves, right? And so we can understand how trafficking sort of impacts our mental health in one way or another. In terms of our health in general, closely linked to our mental health is the impact on the physical health of survivors. Some survivors of trafficking experience things like deprivation of food for long periods of time while they were being trafficked. They lack appropriate dental and medical care while being trafficked. And these cause issues well into their reintegration phase, long after they have left their trafficking experience. So some survivors leave trafficking with issues of malnutrition, they have dental problems, and long-term consequences of physical injuries that were either untreated or were poorly treated while they were being trafficked. Further, some leave their trafficking experience pregnant or with a sexually transmitted infection, or both. And a while ago, I mentioned that some have experiences of substance use disorders as a result of untreated mental illness. But there are also those who may have become addicted to substances while being trafficked, either being forced to use substances by their trafficker as a means of control, or they use substances as a means of coping with their trafficking experiences. And so these things can lead to a host of other medical issues that can carry well into their lives long after trafficking, both in the short term and in the long term. And so in addition to the impact to the health of survivors, we also have the economic impact, which is the next slide, Brian. So many people encounter their trafficking experiences while in pursuit of employment, right? Dr. Marta shared earlier that, often people are trafficked in mines and restaurants and, other locations where they're actually seeking employment. And there are several people who make sacrifices like selling their property and other belongings for the opportunity to migrate to foreign lands, seeking opportunities for themselves and their families. And what trafficking does is that it not only disrupts their dreams, but it disrupts their ability to earn an income as their labor is stolen. And so when they return home to their home countries after the trafficking experience, they return with little to nothing. They have to rebuild their lives. And so they have not only lost their potential source of income, they have lost their ability to earn an income because of some of the physical and mental health issues that they may have experienced while being trafficked. Additionally, survivors return home to face some of the same factors that push them to leave in the first instance, like poverty, their own limited educational attainment, limited job prospects in their own countries, added to which they now have to explain to potential employers the gap in their employment history, which is that time that they were being trafficked. And all of this ultimately lends itself to very challenging circumstances that can last for a very long time for some survivors. And then to make matters worse, survivors also have to navigate the social impact of their experiences. So next slide, Brian. So many survivors face stigma years after returning from their traffickers. For many, stigma goes beyond just harsh words, which is bad enough, but they also experience threats to their lives and ostracism from their families and communities. Stigma is actually one of the biggest barriers to the reintegration of human trafficking survivors. In fact, some survivors choose to stay in the foreign country where they were trafficked with no family or support system, simply to avoid the social stigma in their communities at home. Those who face gossip and threats, those who return face gossip and threats. Some are forced to go to great lengths to hide their experiences, even from immediate family members, to avoid being blamed or viewed as prostitutes in the case of those who may have experienced sex trafficking. For women and girls, it is sometimes difficult to regain acceptance in their communities. In some more traditional societies, these women are ostracized. In one study that I reviewed, this study was done in Vietnam. In those societies, the locals consider human trafficking to be a social evil comparable to prostitution, pornography, premarital and extramarital sex. And so human trafficking survivors are often socially and emotionally isolated. Another study posited that family can be both facilitators and inhibitors of the reintegration process. Reintegration is often impeded by tension between survivors and their family members, often connected to the expectations that family may have had for the survivor. For instance, in some situations, the relative may have agreed to care for the survivor's child with the expectation of financial remuneration, which never materialized because of the trafficking experience. Family members are sometimes disappointed when survivors return without achieving economic success and often view them as worthless. These experiences of stigma and family discord leaves the survivor without critical social support. Studies have found that social support is a major contributing factor in the successful reintegration of human trafficking survivors. Without this support, some survivors experience re-victimization, either through being trafficked again or another form of victimization, such as interpersonal violence or what we call domestic violence. So removal from the trafficking environment does not guarantee the end of hardships and trauma for survivors, or even an easy transition after returning to their country of origin or choosing to stay in the country where they were trafficked. As mentioned in this presentation, survivors often experience multiple challenges, as we see with all of these impacts. While this is not an exhaustive list of all the ways in which survivors may be impacted from their trafficking experience, these are some of the more commonly identified outcomes that we've identified in the research. Survivors may experience all, some, or maybe just one of these in the short and long term. All of this, therefore, necessitates comprehensive programs like our Survivor Leadership Academy, which you will hear a whole lot about, but the picture at the beginning was our awesome survivor leaders. And this is what we need to meet their needs. So at this point, I hand over back to my colleague, Brian, and thank you for this opportunity to speak with you this morning. Okay, Brian may have
yes, I think that Brian had a problem. He mentioned that his internet wasn't the most stable today, so he told me to be in case the second in command. So I'm taking over the ship. And thank you so much, Dr. Giselle, for sharing this insightful presentation. It was super interesting, and I'm sure that we will have a lot of questions to go in more depth on some of the points that you raised. Brian, are you here? Yes, I see Brian is back, so I lost my power back to Brian. Ryan, we just ended the presentation, so you had the perfect timing of rejoining, and the floor is yours.
Okay. My apologies, everyone. My internet connection is a little bit unstable this morning. Giselle, thank you so much for that presentation and for helping us understand how human trafficking affects the different aspects of survivors' lives. It is really important for each of us to understand that for each trafficking case we hear about, it involves a real person who is affected physically, emotionally, and socially. Now that we have had a good background regarding what trafficking is and how it affects survivors, I want to shift our focus to how Free the Slaves is working to end modern slavery and human trafficking around the world. At Free the Slaves, we divide our approach to ending modern slavery and human trafficking into 4 strategic objective areas: engaging local communities, policy and advocacy, movement building, and continuous learning. Our work engaging local communities mobilizes communities to demand recognition of their human and labor rights and access social services and support structures that reduce their vulnerability to the deception, manipulation, and threats of traffickers. By equipping them with the tools to protect themselves and reduce the social, economic, and political isolation of marginalized communities, we pave the way for grassroots resistance against slavery. Free the Slaves policy and advocacy work focuses on influencing governments to adopt transformative policy changes and invest in effective implementation of programs and services in alignment with these policies. Through deep relationships, evidence-backed framework creation, and strategic partnerships, we strive to reform laws and regulations at the international, national, and local levels. Our movement building programs, like the Freedom from Slavery Forum, act as a catalyst for collaboration, knowledge sharing, and collective action within the broader anti-slavery and anti-trafficking movement. We facilitate a collective approach to confront root causes of trafficking and slavery. Additionally, we create and support survivor networks, offering those with firsthand experience a platform to influence future strategies and provide feedback on the effectiveness of current efforts. Free the Slaves' continuous learning focus can be seen in the execution of our research program. We engage in research to inform and enhance our understanding of the communities affected by modern slavery and guide our intervention programs, advocacy efforts, and collective partnerships, ensuring effective and targeted actions that are based on accurate data and analysis. Now that we have covered the strategies that we use in our work, I would like to direct our focus to the different geographic regions where we work and explore how these different strategies are put into place. We'll start with our Asia Regional Director, Kuldeep Chauhan, sharing about our work in India. Kuldeep, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brian. I hope everyone can see my presentation.
We can.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. The world's most populous nation, India, has alarming prevalence of modern slavery with over 11 million slaves, according to 2023 Global Slavery Index. Despite economic growth and technological advancements, slavery remains deeply rooted. Most common forms are forced labor, human trafficking, and child exploitation. However, bonded labor is a predominant form of slavery, and the factors fueling bonded labor include socioeconomic inequalities, caste-based discrimination, and abject poverty. To expand our efforts in addressing bonded labor and human trafficking, the Fostering Free Fee Accountability and Cost Tracking Initiative, as an example, focuses on immediate vulnerabilities and systematic changes. The FACT initiative benefits from a synergy that integrates strategic planning, ethical business practices, and community engagement for a holistic and sustainable impact. Free the Slaves brings extensive experience in combating modern slavery globally through community-based approaches, providing a solid foundation for addressing the issue in India. While our partners for this project, like Varite, bring specialized knowledge in labor rights, ethical recruitment, and supply chain transparency, providing valuable insights into the complexities of the issue. Our local partner, MSCMVS, as a local organization, brings in-depth knowledge of socio-economic landscape in India, facilitating a nuanced understanding of the cultural and regional dynamics. MSCMVS's community-based approach aligns with our own Free the Slaves strategy, ensuring that interventions are culturally sensitive, locally relevant, and capable of fostering sustainable change. India stands as the most significant origin country for international migrants, with an estimated 25 million nationals living abroad. Approximately 40% of these migrants reside and work in the Gulf Cooperation Council states, primarily in blue-collar jobs. While these workers have contributed immensely to the Gulf's economic development, they often suffer from a lack of social security, labor rights, and safety nets. Their vulnerabilities are exacerbated by the kafala system, a foreign labor sponsorship method prevalent in the Gulf, often likened to modern-day slavery. This system, combined with poor living conditions and other exploitative practices like illegal recruitment, has led to numerous challenges, including heat stress-related deaths and recruitment agents holding workers hostage for ransoms. The lack of transparency related to recruitment fees for foreign employment and lack of enforcement of existing laws and regulations has led to a myriad of issues in labor migration corridors, especially between India and GCC states. Lured by the promise of employment, vulnerable workers often find themselves ensnared in debt bondage due to exorbitant recruitment fees, coupled with deceitful practices by recruitment agencies and the lack of oversight by companies and governments. Many workers face a host of challenges, including forced labor, exploitation, and lack of essential rights. Lack of transparency in recruitment fees leads to debt bondage and exploitation. Our intervention, Free the Slaves intervention, conforms to our approach of always being community-oriented, participated, freely sharing knowledge and resources, and building coalitions and partnerships to amplify our impact. So how do we do it? This project focuses on building community resilience at the level of the communities where we are working. We have selected 15 communities to work on. In each of the community, we have formed a migration vigilance committee. These committees play a crucial role in identifying and addressing the local issues which are related to exploitation during when a person approaches the agent, starting with for foreign employment. So these migration vigilance committees at the community level fosters community resilience. Notable members of the community are members of this migration vigilance committees, including local government officials. They sit together and develop safe migration action plans. Each migration vigilance committee also maintains a register of international blue-collar migrants and collect data of the recruitment fees charged to them, while maintaining proper diligence and privacy of the information collected. Second, our EFFACT initiative focuses on empowering workers through information, and we are doing this primarily through our Safe Tips guide. This is a guide developed to raise awareness about the risk faced by the workers who are seeking foreign employments, particularly in Gulf states. It encourages civil society, workers' organization to share pre-employment guidance with Indian workers. Till now, we have trained many community members in the Safe Tips guide and handed them the Safe Tips guide, and in turn, they raise awareness in their local communities. Our third initiative is to build government capacity, and we have trained a lot of government officials in the Safe Tips guide, and the project focuses on enhancing the understanding and awareness of government officials. And finally, we are empowering these job seekers digitally by using Just Good Work app, which is in the local language, and developing a website with all the information we have collected and the learnings we have collected for this project. Our impact, which we can already see on the ground and we anticipate when the project ends, is increased corporate accountability, wherein our partner Varite is speaking to corporates in the GCC states while we are raising awareness with the workers and international migrants and with the civil society. We hope through these initiatives, we will see clear reduction in exploitative practices, transparency and fair reporting in terms of how much recruitment fees the worker is being charged, and does this worker subsidize the HR recruitment cost of the company in the GCC state, and finally empowered civil society and public at large. Thank you for your time today. Over to Brian.
Thank you, Kuldeep, for sharing about our work with safe migration in India. Again, if you have any questions for Kuldeep, add them to the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to answer them either in the chat or at the Q&A section at the end of this presentation. Now I'd like to invite Adrian Alexander, our Advocacy and Movement Building Country Manager in Trinidad and Tobago, to share about our policy and advocacy work in the Caribbean region. Adrian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Brian. From the East Indies to the West Indies. It's my pleasure to greet each and every one of you from the beautiful Caribbean. And I will share my screen at this time. Okay. Kindly confirm that you can see it, Brian. Okay, great. As Brian indicated, I'll be focusing on our advocacy efforts here in the Caribbean. Much of our focus is on the full member states of CARICOM. You'd see they cover from Belize in the west, Bahamas to the north, Barbados to the east, and Suriname and Guyana on the South American mainland to the south. Our entry into the Caribbean actually began in 2008 when Freed Slaves began doing programs in Haiti. And over that time, we've been able to partner with numerous organizations and impact communities where the rest of the system of child domestic servitude has been an institution in Haiti for centuries. One of the things that we've been able to glean from the work there is really some of the success stories and also some of the programs that have worked in those communities, and those are incorporated along with learnings from other parts of the world into our Community Liberation Initiative Toolkit. In 2022, we expanded to the English-speaking Caribbean with the establishment of a post here in Trinidad and Tobago advocacy and one building country manager. And in 2023, we had the very first Freedom from Slavery Regional Forum in the English-speaking Caribbean and in the Caribbean as a whole, actually. That took place in Trinidad and Tobago in February. We were able to see participation from attendees either in person or online from most of those 15 CARICOM territories. And the overall feedback from participants is that they tremendously enjoyed not only the forum, but also the networking that the forum facilitated, as many individuals not only learned about human trafficking for the first time or expanded their knowledge, but were able to make contact with organizations and individuals who are doing similar work, not only in the region, but outside of the region who joined remotely. Following the forum, we were able to engage in activities whereby we promoted the Pathfinder Country Initiative of Alliance 8.7, and Brian shared some of that work when he gave the overview on our international advocacy initiatives. We also worked with new organizations in the region and formed new partnerships. And that is a process that's ongoing. So if you are within the Caribbean and you're on this webinar, feel free to reach out. Our contact information will be on the last slide, and you'll be able to make contact with us, find out more about what we're doing and how you can collaborate with us to eliminate the conditions that allow modern slavery to persist here in the Caribbean. We also registered Free the Slaves in Trinidad and Tobago, so that's our first registration in the Caribbean region. So we really celebrate that, and we look forward to continuing to expand our work through that means. We're in 2024, and for this year and forward, we are looking initially at our second regional forum that will be in Jamaica in May of this year, and we will continue to promote the Pathfinder Country Initiative. We're launching also the Caribbean Research Program with Dr. Marta Furlan, who spoke earlier, and we'll be establishing a coalition for civil society organizations that are combating modern slavery, and also working towards the development of a survivors network for regional survivors. As I mentioned, Alliance 8.7 and Pathfinder Country Initiative, we found that a lot of individuals and organizations within the region are unaware of what this is. And I'm sure Brian may share some more information later on, or you can ask during the Q&A. But Alliance 8.7 was established as a framework in the year 2016 to fast-track the implementation of Target 8.7 of the Sustainable Development Goals. While there are Pathfinder countries established around the world and even in Latin America, and these are countries that have committed to go faster and further towards implementing Target 8.7, including creating country roadmaps that bring a whole of government approach to combating modern slavery, human trafficking, forced labor, and child labor. As I mentioned, there is no Pathfinder country in the Caribbean, so we've been collaborating with international agencies that work in the region towards the formation of a technical team to promote the Pathfinder Country Initiative with governments and other stakeholders in our region. Over the past months, we've been able to introduce the concept of Pathfinder Country as well as Alliance 8.7 as a whole, several national and regional government representatives, as well as stakeholders from both civil society and the business sectors. And there's really been generating a considerable amount of interest so that we can see how the Pathfinder Country Initiative and country roadmaps as a whole can bring about the more effective use of resources, especially in the Caribbean where resource allocation is a challenge, how we can see that work in our favor at a national level and bring all of government as well as all of society to combat these four human rights abuses. To further that, we've seen that there's some concern expressed among some of the regional stakeholders in terms of they don't know how this has worked for other Pathfinder countries, the process of application, as well as what benefits that they may have derived from becoming a Pathfinder country. And therefore, we're in talks with a Pathfinder country in West Africa that's also a Commonwealth member country, so that there will be similarities to what they have encountered and what they are benefiting from, and some of the challenges that they encountered becoming and maintaining their Pathfinder country status with what we have in primarily the former British colonies here in the region. As I mentioned, we're also looking at strengthening advocacy through the formation of a regional coalition that will bring multiple voices to speak to the regional institutions of government, and also to strengthen their individual work and building capacity in them and their partners to combat the various forms of modern slavery in the region. And of course, survivor engagement is at the core of the work that we do here in Free the Slaves across the world, as you heard Dr. Giselle Balfour explain earlier. And therefore, helping regional survivors form networks and position them to take key roles in influencing anti-slavery policies, legislation, and procedures. That would be the focus of our survivors network to be formed in our region going forward. As I mentioned, if you need to make contact with us, whether to have discussions towards collaboration and partnerships in any initiatives here in the region, our contact information is on this slide. And with that, I will hand over to Brian. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Adrian, for that window into the important work happening in the Caribbean region. For those of you interested in our work with Alliance 8.7 and for more information on what Alliance 8.7 is all about, there are 2 additional webinars on our YouTube channel about Alliance 8.7. You can just search for Free the Slaves on YouTube, and you'll find those in the webinar section. And there is also additional information on our website at freetheslaves.net regarding Alliance 8.7 and how we are working with that coalition to further anti-slavery efforts around the world. And again, if you have questions for Adrian about the work in the Caribbean, please add them to the Q&A, and we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. Our next presenter is Hema Bahardi, our regional manager for Latin America and Europe, and she will be sharing about our recent research project in Peru. Hema?
Thank you, Brian. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, everyone. One moment. Okay, before starting, I want to thank the audience present today, their interest in participating in this event and for learning about our work, of which we are very, very proud. Okay, as my colleagues mentioned, our work constantly shows us that human trafficking, despite being a global problem, has particular expression and manifestation at the local level that we must address and take into account to propose effective responses. This is why Free the Slave works from a community approach to achieve effective strategies against human trafficking. We must design responses adapted to the particularities for each context. In order to achieve this objective, we carry out evidence-based research that allow us to identify the dynamics to slavery that occur in each context and its causes. According to the United Nations, it's estimated that there are 476 million indigenous people worldwide and 54.8 million in Latin America and the Caribbean. Although they only constitute 6% of the world's population, they represent around 19% of the extreme poverty in the world. Our research between neglect and exploitation for case studies of indigenous communities in the Peruvian Amazon makes visible how ethnic, racial discrimination, inequality, and poverty inherited from colonialism continue to manifest today, but with renewed forms of exclusion and domination, ways that increase the exposure and risks of indigenous people to human trafficking. Below, I will present the goals and main findings of our research. Regarding the goals, they are: first, evaluate the relationship between human trafficking, the non-formal extractive economy, climate change, and indigeneity. The second one, investigate the vulnerability factors of indigenous communities in informal economic contexts and how these are associated with both criminal behavior and victimization. This research was carried out in 4 indigenous communities in the Peruvian Amazon, together with our local partner, the indigenous NGO Onotsi, who supported us with fieldwork and the translation of the research into the Ashaninka language. Is the first research on the topic in the Ashaninka language. We are very committed to the preservation, revitalization, and promotion of indigenous languages. Regarding the main findings, first, the 4 communities studied show an evident systematic and historical violation of rights, such as lack of access and coverage to basic public services, precarious socioeconomic condition, extreme poverty, lack of employment, and gender violence. The second one, the scarce presence of the state favors the proliferation of illicit activities such as mining and illegal logging, drug trafficking, sexual exploitation, as well as corruption and impunity for these crimes. Third, corruption and impunity for crime are a constant in the communities studied, normalizing the violation of individual and collective rights as a common practice. 4, there is no statistical data disaggregated by race or ethnicity on cases of human trafficking, forced labor, and other forms of exploitation. Non-disaggregated data hides information about how inequality makes indigenous communities more susceptible to human trafficking. 5, various forms of human trafficking were identified in the indigenous communities studied, such as labor and sexual exploitation, child labor, and child marriage. 6, the constant pressure for the illicit exploitation of natural resources in the territories of indigenous communities has increased the levels of violence, especially towards environmental defenders and community leaders. 7, the accelerated deforestation and degradation of indigenous territories are seriously altering the local ecosystem and contributing to exacerbating the effects of climate change. And the last one, 8, indigenous communities and their leaders are criminalized for environmental crimes without considering whether these crimes have occurred under coercion, threat, deception, or abuse of their vulnerable situation. The next steps. Our research is section-oriented. It's a key input to design action aimed at improving the fight against human trafficking in different countries. In this case, our initial proposal for the country are public presentation of results and recommendation of the research to the Peruvian government, indigenous organizations and NGOs, and United Nations agencies. Promote and facilitate spaces for dialogue between interested parties to address the recommendation presented in the research. Train indigenous organizations on the crimes of human trafficking and forced labor, how to identify it, how to act, and how to negotiate indigenous demands with the government. And the last one, promote political advocacy actions against human trafficking through national networks and coalitions aimed at achieving the legislative changes necessary. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, you can write them in the chat and I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma, for sharing about the challenges faced by indigenous groups in Peru that were uncovered through the research project there. If you are interested in learning more about this research project, you can find the full report on other information on our research page on our website at freetheslaves.net. And you can, of course, add any questions for Gemma in the chat or in the Q&A section, and we'll be happy to answer those as we can. Now I'd like to invite Jacqueline Melende, our Senior Regional Manager for East and Central Africa, and our survivor engagement lead to share about some of the groundbreaking work with survivor engagement that she has been leading in East and Central Africa. Jacqueline?
Thank you so much, Brian. Just a second, I don't know if you can see my screen already.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. Okay, great. So thank you so much. So I'm gonna talk about survivor engagement in the context of, the evolving environment of survivor engagement in the movement of anti-trafficking. So we're looking at survivor engagement with a goal of empowering leaders who are survivors in the anti-trafficking movement. And most of this presentation will be based on the work of Free the Slaves in East and Central Africa, where most of this work on survivor engagement has been happening. So just to get us on the same platform, maybe there are some of the concepts we can just understand, or some of the nuances around survivor engagement that we need to get out of the way. So the concept of survivor leadership and advocacy for us in essence, when we are talking about survivor engagement, we are talking about survivors that have gone beyond receiving just services from organizations, or they have reached a point where they need to be part of the movement in terms of working in the movement, contributing to the objectives of the movement, and giving their expertise of lived experience to the work of the anti-trafficking movement. So when we talk about survivor leadership and advocacy, most we are talking about survivors who have passed through a lot of stages before they can reach at this point. We are looking at survivors who have, passed through rescue, reintegration, socioeconomic care, livelihood support, education, and then now they are in a position where they can even run organizations, they can run initiatives, and they can also support other survivors and victims of human trafficking. So we are, we are trying to harden on the traditional perspective of survivors as recipients of services. That component of survivors receiving services is important because that's where we start. That is the foundation where we start. But we are also looking to complement that foundation and Free the Slaves. What else can we do to add on the holistic building of survivor leaders from the movement? We believe that not all survivors want to be leaders, not all survivors want to be advocates, but all survivors want to be rescued somehow or want to rescue themselves. There's that bit. Then there's a crop of a percentage of those who have received services who want to go ahead and participate in leadership of the movement and lead and shape policies. So those are the survivors we are talking about when we are looking at survivor engagement in this context. So we are actually trying to advocate for a paradigm shift in recognizing survivors as leaders, but not just subjects in, for example, our researches, our program, and also our engagement with communities. So survivor leadership, in essence, gives survivors opportunities to lead and make decisions so their voices and experiences are valued. And then it also promotes trust and a more inclusive movement. And then also survivor-led initiatives are very key in addressing the complex issues of human trafficking effectively because of the wealth of knowledge they have, first-hand knowledge on how the system of human trafficking happens. So they are the ones who have that raw information that can be utilized in programming, in research, and even in advocacy. So what is important of survivor leadership and advocacy? So as I've indicated before, one of the crucial role of survivor leaders is shaping policies, programs, and the public awareness. Because what they inject in those processes is something that theoretically is impossible for someone to think about, no matter how much you learn or how many degrees you have on human trafficking, on issues of modern slavery, even when you write books and you do researches, when that voice or that element of the lived experience is missing, the study or the programming is never complete. It's usually missing some gaps. Sometimes for a lack of a better word, because somehow it's half-baked or it's armchair kind of work. So that's why it's very important for us to look at survivor involvement not just as a tokenistic way, but something that we are starting with them from the beginning. We're starting with survivors and leaders and advocates from the beginning, because they contribute in dismantling systemic issues, even in organizations we work in, even in movements that we work in, and they challenge stereotypes and the common beliefs that people believe about who is a survivor, and also bring to the center the approach of survivor-centricism. So what are the principles of survivor engagement that we are using to cultivate leadership in the East and Central Africa? So we are using opportunities for leadership roles. So if there are leadership roles where survivors there are leaders that are being chosen in any forum on anti-trafficking or any other forum that we come across, we are trying to bring these opportunities closer to the survivors. We opening the communication and the information for them to access this, and then also creating supportive and inclusive environment through different stakeholders and allies who work with survivors, and also different, partnering with different survivor networks and groups, and also recognizing that survivors are not homogeneous. They come from different spaces with different experiences and different expertise. So having a space for that and recognizing that all approaches do not fit, not one approach that fits how we engage with survivors and survivor leaders. So looking at the inclusive leadership, we're looking at issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion within the anti-trafficking movement, especially in the East and Central Africa. So we have some of survivors leaders in action. I think some of them are here that have done tremendous work, some from a long time ago, some have started just recently, but they're doing very great work. We have Awa and Eunice from Cameroon. They run a robust survivor-led initiative called the Survivor for survivor women in Cameroon, and supporting their life skills, their economic empowerment, and also their education. And we do have another one from Kenya. She's Brenda. Brenda has been selected as advisory board member of Awareness Against Trafficking, where she will be supporting the organization to shape programs and also in implementation. Then we do have Jennifer from Tanzania. Jennifer is working on community empowering a community of survivors to be self-resilient. So she's like a community mobilizer and a community educator for other survivors in Tanzania. And then we have Benedict, who is one of our own. Benedict is the country director for DRC, and she also works in supporting, building the life skills of survivors and bringing network of survivors together, and she has been recently selected to the task force of the Democratic Republic of Congo government as a member of the task force on the drafting of the roadmap for the Alliance 8.7. Then we have Shivan and Angela, who are working on issues of sexual minorities in Uganda and looking at the intersection of that with human trafficking. And they recently founded a new organization called African Alia. So they just started. So if you're interested in working with a new organization that has very robust leaders coming up, and in Uganda, I think you can contact us, or you can just write something on the chat if you would want to work with any of these leaders. There are also others in other countries in East and Central Africa, or if you are interested to work with a survivor-led organization, and I think that should be the way anyway. If you're working in anti-slavery movement and you are seeking to work in a specific country, I think the best one is to have an initiative that you are supported by a survivor leader. So in terms of what survivors are engaged in East and Central Africa, they are engaged in policy advocacy and legislative change. And I would mention the Alliance 8.7, which is a process that is happening in DRC and Kenya, where survivors have been in the forefront in creating, the skeleton for what the roadmap will be when the states will be able to write their roadmap that will be presented in the Alliance 8.7. So Alliance 8.7 is a movement or a collaboration between states, agencies, educational research institutes, NGOs, and survivor-led organizations in targeting SDG 8.7, of fighting human trafficking, child labor, modern slavery, and forced labor. So countries have to be members and be referred as to pathfinders, and they make commitment that they are going to fight the scourge of human trafficking and modern slavery. And this process has ways it has to be achieved. It has principles that guide how a country comes with a roadmap. And one of the requirements is to have survivors be part of the movement and be part of designing that roadmap. And we are happy to say that survivors, leaders, and survivor advocates in both Kenya and DRC, they have worked so hard to come with recommendations that will be used by both DRC government and Kenyan government to write the roadmap that will be used to gauge the state against, performance in terms of putting to an end human trafficking and modern slavery. So another thing that survivor leaders are engaged in is measuring impact and accountability. So after the roadmap have been presented to the Alliance 8.7, the survivors will be the monitors in the ground to see if the states are committing to what they said and also supporting. There are also, there's a research that we did on survivor engagement for East and Central Africa, where we looked at how organizations engage with survivors beyond service delivery. And that research is set to be launched very soon. And then after that, there will be implementation part where Free the Slaves will work with different organizations to implement the finding of the research, talking about what organizations need to adopt in their workings and in their frameworks, so that they can be able to engage survivors effectively in what they do, especially anti-trafficking organizations. So the other thing is that what survivors are doing, they are doing a lot of community engagement and awareness. in the communities. They are always invited in forums and panels. I think there's no month that passes before we have survivor leaders and advocates traveling and also doing some of the community awareness locally in their respective countries. So they have been busy doing a lot of work and bringing a lot of awareness on this issue from a personal perspective of their experience. And then also another thing that is happening in terms of survivor leaders is the global collaboration and partnership. So there's a lot that has happened since Free the Slaves started working in East and Central Africa in terms of collaboration and partnership. Recently, we launched the Survivor Academy that encompasses different survivor leaders from different countries in East and Central Africa that will have spearheaded the inaugural academy, trying to build leaders in the movement. So we hope we will be supporting different leaders every year and building these leaders to this movement. And I say one of the results we are seeing from the academy is how the leaders who are in the academy some have been able to found their own initiatives, and others were able to run their own projects and also do a lot of work and also write a lot on the issues that affect survivors in the human trafficking space. So so I've talked about policy and advocacy legislative change that survivors have been doing, which is very crucial in addressing systematic gaps, and also the measuring impact and accountability in terms of the research, and also doing monitoring and accountability of the processes in the movement. So, and also community engagement, where survivors are spearheading or leading initiatives in the community and educating and mobilizing communities. So, and also global partnership, as I have indicated, that alliances with both international and local stakeholders for unified efforts and cross-learning, that is something that has been happening in this space of survivor leadership. So in conclusion, I would say empowering leadership is very important in driving change and fostering survivor engagement in anti-trafficking movement. And I believe together we can create a world free from modern slavery. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline, for that excellent overview of survivor engagement and how Free the Slaves is engaging survivors in East and Central Africa. I'm looking at the time and I'm conscious that we are running behind schedule. So if any of our guests need to leave for other commitments at any point, I just wanted to remind you that we will be posting the recording of the webinar on our YouTube channel in the next week or two. And
Okay, it looks like Brian had an internet connection, unfortunately, so we will give him the opportunity to rejoin. In the meantime, we will continue. Thank you so much, Jacqueline, for sharing with us all the amazing work that you've been leading in Central and East Africa with the survivors. And now we'll invite our West Africa Director, Issa Saka, to share about the work that Free the Slaves is doing with sex trafficking in Senegal and Mauritania. Issa, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marta. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to present on the programs and initiative in West Africa. Please let me first explain that we have our regional office now based in Dakar, Senegal, and we have programs and projects in countries like Senegal, Mauritania, and Accra. But I will be mentioning some of the few work we're doing currently in Senegal and also Mauritania. Let me full screen. Hope everyone can see my presentation. Okay, thanks.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so first of all, let me give you an overview, general overview, because we mentioned some forms of exploitation, but in West Africa, the main one are forced labor with 57%, and you have sexual exploitation 41%. As I was mentioning, in Senegal, we have currently a project working on sexual exploitation in the southeast of Senegal. And in Mauritania, we have race-based slavery, a project currently going on, and we trying to work around these two forms of exploitation. One of the main forms, as I mentioned, for Mauritania is the race-based slavery. And we have 90,000 people, 2% of the population, which are held in condition of modern-day slavery. Let me explain that slavery in Mauritania dates back centuries when Arab Berber raided and enslaved Black Africans settled along the Senegal River, forcing them to the bottom of race-based social system. The Arab Berber elite and light-skinned Moors, who make up about 1/3 of the population, continue race-based slavery today. This form of slavery is largely descent-driven, where dark-skinned Haratins are bounded to the family of those who enslaved them. Many are unaware that their exploitation is illegal, and in some cases, slavery survivors continue to serve their slaveholders after obtaining freedom out of gratefulness and habit. Their lack of access to education, decent labor, justice, political representation, and other rights are amplified by widespread systemic racism. In Senegal, as I was saying, we have several forms, but one of the ones which we are tackling is sexual exploitation, which take place in one of the regions called Kédougou in the southeast of Senegal. In this region, we have experienced gold rush boom in artisanal and small-scale mining. It's a primary source of income for communities in the region, but it has led to sex trafficking of adolescent girls and young women within Senegal, as well as in neighboring countries, such as the Gambia, Guinea-Conakry, Guinea-Bissau, Nigeria, and Ghana. These girls and women are often lured from their communities with promises of formal employment in Europe or elsewhere, but find themselves trapped in forced sex work. Based on the qualitative result, some victims of sex trafficking came from Nigeria. We have 68%. This is followed by Senegalese community, 13%, by Mali, 12%, and other countries, 8%. Most victims of sex trafficking have been to school, with nearly half having attended secondary school and higher school. We have 48%. 64% of sex trafficking victims reporting experiencing at least one detrimental living condition before engaging in commercial sex. What do we do? Our intervention in Senegal is based around 3 components. We are working through the identification and assistance of victims, and we're doing this with our partners who have some shelters. One of them is called La Lumière, and the other one is called ENDA, which we support in identifying the victims and giving them assistance. This assistance can vary from medical assistance, offering them shelter, accommodation, psychosocial support, and eventually supporting them to return to their communities and being reintegrated. We also do a lot of awareness raising within the local communities, because unfortunately, this form of exploitation is based most of the time on some social traditions, some harmful traditions, and also sometimes from some social norms. And we have to educate the communities and support them in changing the attitudes and later on changing the norms around this aspect. We do a lot of advocacy and capacity building for state and non-state actors because unfortunately, these are very complex issues. And within even some people who might be in charge of enforcing the laws, you may find people who are not very familiar, who don't know a lot about human trafficking. And we do a lot of capacity building for magistrates, for police officers, for gendarmes, but also for some community leaders to help them bring the changes, and also for the police officers enforce the law. In Mauritania, we do work to build social inclusion of structurally and historical marginal groups, because as I was saying, we have a lot of them who are uneducated. And even sometimes if you support in freeing them, they would go back to their communities and being exploited. So we do try to build the capacities and helping them get more included in the society. And there also we do a lot of capacity building for community leaders and journalists, and we do awareness raising and advocacy among community leaders, among journalists and government officials. In terms of results, I would like to share some of them. For instance, in Senegal, we supported 131 victims, and we freed them from sexual exploitation. These were accommodated in the shelter. They were supported medically. They were given food. They were supported psychosocially. And we discussed with them to help them redefine projects that would help them reintegrate and return to their communities. We did a lot of training also, as I was mentioning. Here we have trained 759 people that were trained. We also train magistrates, we train police officers, and also for them to be able to prosecute traffickers. In Mauritania, we have built two survival networks. We have trained 15 journalists and 15 non-governmental people, and we raised awareness for 200,000 people. So this also is helping them to change the norm and change from this very entrenched and old practice, which is race-based slavery. Thank you very much for listening. Over to you, Dr. Marta.
Thank you, Issa. I see that Brian is back, so we'll go back to hosting this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. And again, my apologies for my terrible internet connection here. Hopefully it will last a little bit longer this time. Thank you, Issa, so much for sharing about our work in Mauritania and Senegal. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving quickly to our next presenter, Rasha Al-Manha, our regional manager for the Middle East and North Africa, to share about an advocacy project that we're working on in the MENA region. Rasha?
Yes, thank you, Brian. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us in this webinar. I'll just share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Right, great. All right, so my name is Rasha. I am FTS MENA Regional Manager, and I will be presenting FTS work inside MENA region, specifically to our project in Kuwait, highlighting the project goal and achievements. So to summarize the project, FTS and NAD are collaborating on a project to strengthen civil society coordination for the marginalized groups inside Kuwait. The goal of this project is to reduce the vulnerability and enhance the acceptance of the Bedouin people into the mainstream of the society. This is also to ensure their human, political, and economic and social rights are being shared within the mainstream inside Kuwait. The project will be using FTS Community Liberation Toolkit, Module 1 and Module 3, in order to engage the vulnerable communities and protect them from exploitation and marginalization. I'd like to give a brief introduction about the project target group. The Bedouin people, they are a stateless and unregistered population in Kuwait. They have been marginalized and oppressed for decades, with no political representation or access for basic services inside Kuwait. The Kuwaiti government the Kuwaiti government policy continue of harassment and intimidation that is contradicting with human rights principles, and the government downgraded the status to the Bedouin people to illegal residents in 2010. Regarding the project and under the partnerships, FTS has established a partnership with South Company, which is a specialized company in producing podcasts, in order to produce 4 episode podcasts on modern slavery. It was launched in December 2022. The podcast episodes are produced in Arabic in order to target a larger audience of the Arabic group or Arabic speakers in the Middle East and North Africa, featuring stories and interviews of the victims inside the region. A general overview of the podcast topics. So the first episode, which is under the title, The Concept of Modern Slavery, explains the meaning of modern slavery and tell historical stories about forms of slavery that exist in the region. For example, the story of forced labor of the Egyptians to dig the Suez Canal. And also in this episode, the aim was to raise numerous questions about the distinctions between slavery in its modern form in comparison to the ancient form. The second episode, which is also titled as the employment right for the Kuwait of Bedouin. This episode focuses on the Kuwaiti Bedouin and also interviews and conduct with Bedouin of Kuwait, activists and other Bedouin female workers, in order for them to share their stateless citizenship status and how much it has limited their access to free education, health services, and how they are subject to political, social, and economic pressures that has resulted in limited employment opportunities for them. The third and the second episodes discuss the issues of child labor in Yemen, as we have 2 types of child labor in Yemen. One of them is inside the family business, as children are being, supporting their parents in cot trade. Particularly, the work is difficult and dangerous for them, that prevents children from exercising their fundamental rights. And also there are other types of child labor, of children working outside their family businesses, for example, working with employers, traders, and other business owners, which also put the children under the exposure of high-risk situations that may result in sexual harassments and other forms of exploitation. Regarding the impact of the episode sponsored by FTS, and as you can see from the chart, by end of 2023, 5 podcast episodes have been produced under FTS activities. As you can see, the dissemination has been successful over the year, with an 82% increase in Saudi Arabia number of listeners, 25 and 23% in Jordan and Egypt, and also we have an increase up to 7% regarding number of listeners inside Kuwait. The total number of listeners in 2023 is 27,064, and it is distributed among 4 top listener countries: Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Kuwait, and Egypt. That is indicating that these countries are interested in having a dialogue on modern slavery issues, with an average rate of 15% in Q1, 31% in Q2 and Q3, and 61% raise in Q4. Additional podcast is now being under process with the purpose of specifically covering the civil rights of the Bedouin people and the injustice they are facing inside Kuwait. This podcast that is under preparation now aims to shed the light on the struggles and the discrimination faced by the Bedouin community, and highlighting their fight of recognition, getting access to equal rights and access to basic services such as education and healthcare. Throughout this podcast, our aim is to amplify the voices of the Bedouin people by sharing their stories and hoping to raise awareness and foster a greater understanding of the challenges faced by the Bedouin people and their quest for justice and equality. This is just a summary of FTS MENA main achievements. I would be more than happy to respond to any questions, or if you would like to provide any additional information about MENA FTS work. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Rasha. This was super interesting, and congratulations on all this work that you've been doing with the podcast. It's great. So as we concluded this webinar, I just want to pick a couple of questions that our audience has been putting in the chat. So there is one on that I think Giselle, perhaps Dr. Giselle, you are the person best suited to address. If there is any advice or suggestion of resources to how to work with suicide prevention among survivors of human trafficking.
Thanks, Marta. Are we talking, I think the question was about resources. Is that what they're asking for?
Yes, suggestions of resources, yes.
Okay, absolutely. I'll be happy to send you some resources after I think you left your email information. I'll be happy to send you some resources. But the main thing would be ensuring that survivors are connected to appropriately trained mental health professionals. It depends, right? So we want to ensure that, because not every, I am a social worker, I work in I'm part of the mental health fraternity. Not every therapist is trained to deal with the trauma. And I talked earlier about complex trauma that survivors entail. And so they have to be trauma trained. In the US with children, we use trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. And there are other forms of therapeutic modules that are used with adults and different persons. So we want to ensure that survivors are connected to the correct assistance that they can have to deal with the mental health issues that lead to that suicidal ideations. But I'll be happy to share some resources. I guess it depends on what part of the world you're in. But I'll be happy to share once we get off of this call. I think, Brian, are you back?
I am back, yes. Thank you, Giselle, for taking that question. Again, we're way over time here, so I'm going to try and go through these questions quickly. William is asking, how do you prioritize countries for allocation of efforts and resources, and how does efficiency come into play? For example, if a country's government is authoritarian or unsupportive of your efforts. I think actually probably because Kuldeep is here, and Kuldeep, can you speak to that briefly regarding our work in India, how we navigate the complexity of governments who don't really want to acknowledge slavery or have restrictions on what is possible there?
Yes, thank you, William, for that question. So yeah, Brian directed that question to me. So I'll speak on the context in Asia. We work in countries like Vietnam and India, which closely matches the description you have said, particularly unsupportive. So I would say that most of the governments in Asia do not recognize modern slavery as a term, because uh, more or less they see it as a threat to their business interest, and a lot of regulations which have come up regarding slave labor use in Europe and America. So they fear that might affect them. So it is very difficult for organizations, especially international organizations like Free the Slaves, to work freely and openly. So the kind of restrictions we face is, the first restriction is that we are not allowed to register as a non-government organization or a community-based organization. So it is not explicit, but it becomes very, very difficult to register when they see our focus is human rights, work on modern slavery, etc. Also, once you are an international organization, it is very difficult to get validation from the government, the kind of programs and efforts you are trying to do in, particularly I'll speak about India and Vietnam. Very, very difficult to collaborate with government agencies. How do we overcome that? Is we work with local partners, and all our work is implemented by local partners who have made a good name of themselves with a decades-long work. Their track record speaks for themselves. They comply with all the local regulations. And most importantly, we work with the declared priorities of the government. So we work closely with, for example, the enforcement authorities, the authorities in power, who particularly look after international migration in the case of the project which I just presented. So we try to work, we try to see what are their objectives, what they are trying to address, and work closely with them rather than, so we work with them in a collaborative way rather than in opposition or taking a very activist approach. So this is how we have been working in these countries, and our work is now decades long in these regions. So yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that explanation, Kuldeep. I think that was very helpful. I'm going to jump to a short question quick, and then we'll for Rasha, and then we'll come back to Kuldeep regarding some other things with migration issues in India. I realize that we are over time, but I see that most people are still with us, and so I'll take that as a indication that you're interested in the answers to these questions, and we'll just go through them quickly as we can. So for Rasha, John Walther is asking if you can comment on access to the podcasts in countries who are reluctant to report or acknowledge modern slavery in the Middle East.
Yes, Brian. Well, basically, in my presentation, we have presented the top 4 countries that are listening or have a huge number of listeners accessing the podcast. However, and according to the indicators that we have, the podcast have listeners across the majority of MENA countries, some of them mainly talking about the Gulf area, the GCC area, who could be considered more challenging countries when talking about modern slavery or human trafficking issues. I would be more than happy to share further statistics and information about the podcast, and maybe I will be also sharing the link for the podcast in our chat box.
Excellent, thank you. So John, if you have any further questions, you can email info@freetheslaves.net, and we'll get your questions forwarded on to Rasha, and you guys can continue that conversation as is necessary. So I'm going to circle back to Paula's question. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Kuldeep, these are for you. There's a number of questions in
Yes.
Paula's Q&A thing there. If you've read through them, maybe I'll just let you speak to them. Otherwise, I can pull them out one by one. Up to you.
Yes, Brian, I'll briefly address these questions and club them. Thank you, Paula, for these very important questions. First of all, your question is about the response of Indian government in safe migration. So I would like to say that the Indian government has taken several steps to address safe migration and protect vulnerable migrants. These includes the implementation of various kinds of laws and policies which the government has enacted at safeguarding the rights of migrant workers. However, what we see in the policy front, the policy is very good, but the enforcement and the awareness about this policies is certainly lacking and is not up to the mark. So, for example, government has initiatives such as e-migrate system. So this has been introduced to streamline the immigration process and ensure better protection for Indian workers going abroad. Additionally, Indian government has initiated bilateral agreements with several destination countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates to enhance the welfare of Indian immigrants. However, Indian migrants. However, having said that, as I said, there is still a lot of scope in terms of, awareness amongst the migrant laborers and also the enforcement capacity of the Indian government. About the illegal recruitment fees, the Indian government has established some regulatory frameworks. For example, the Immigration Act of 1983 and the Protector of Immigrants system. Actually, in our project which we are doing, we work very closely with the Protector of Immigrants who's work in consultation and also build their capacity in terms of pre-departure training, etc. So this Protector of Immigrant system and the Immigrant Act 1983 are in place to monitor the recruitment agencies and ensure compliance with regulations. However, the effectiveness of these measures vary considerably, and as I said again, there are challenges in enforcement. The victims can seek remedies through legal channels like approaching the local police and also the Protector of Immigrant. We are working with the Protector of Immigrant, and the government is investing on improving the functionality of tip reporting protocols. Now you had questions about international students in Canada. So yes, in the media, the government, etc., all are cognizant of the international students facing challenges in Canada. The issues you mentioned, such as unethical recruitment fees, are recognized problems, definitely. And there are various organizations and advocacy groups who are addressing these issues. And on the side of Canada, what we hear is the Canadian government and educational institutes have also recently taken some steps to ensure the well-being of international students, including providing support services and promoting awareness about their rights. So there are other organizations who are working on it. If we speak about Free the Slaves, our work is also at a global scale, addressing human trafficking and exploitation, but specific details in particularly combating recruitment fees for international students in Canada. Other organizations are working on it, and we know of their work. Regarding our Safe Tips guide and other resources, Paula, I would recommend that you can go to our website. On the Free the Slaves website, if you go and you go to the country list, India, the program is described in detail, and the Safe Tips guide is also uploaded on our website, which can be downloaded from there. Thank you so much for your questions. I hope I have answered all the queries you have.
Okay, Kuldeep, just while I have you here, Ansur is asking if India has a bilateral agreement with Saudi Arabia, just as a quick additional
Yes,
question.
as far as we know, India has bilateral agreements with Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And let me look here. There was one other question I was going to try and get to. Oh, okay. So Ansur was asking, who will support trafficked victims when the cases run for years and years? I think that probably depends very much on the geographical location. But I'm going to turn that question to our West Africa director, Isa, who has extensive experience working with the UN in anti-trafficking cases. So maybe, Isa, do you have any insight that you can provide for that question?
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Yeah, of course, it will depend, as you say, on the geography of the question, but most of the time, since we are project-based, if we have the funds and we have been supporting in the identification and assistance to the victim, then we would, of course, provide funds for the return in the family, the reunification into his family or her family, and then also put in place project for the reintegration. And we would also do the monitoring to make sure that the victim is staying back in within the community, and the project that was designed for her, because the project also is designed with the victim. It's not our project, it's her project or his project, and we make sure that the project is still sustainable with the monitoring that we do. So we do support with the funding we receive, of course, from donors. Thank you very much. We lost Brian, it seems.
Okay, yeah, I see him still here, but probably his connection froze. Okay, so I think that with this, we covered all the questions that were put in our chat. And thank you to all the participants who stayed until the very end. So as we close this webinar that commemorates Human Trafficking Awareness Month, we would really like to thank each of you for attending the webinar and sharing your important time with us. If you would like to connect with us further about any of the programs or information that was shared today, you can email us at info@freedomslaves.net, and we will be happy to provide more information and connect you with a relevant team member. We would also like to invite you to visit the Take Action page on our website, freedomslaves.net, which will connect you with lots of different resources on human trafficking, how to be an ethical consumer, how to take action, and many other topics. Finally, we would like to recognize that all the programs that our colleagues share about today require funding to maintain, so we invite you to join our network of financial supporters and help us expand our fight against human trafficking and modern slavery and protect the survivor of these terrible crimes. Also, if you're not already following us on social media, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or how it's now called the X, whatever you're preferring to use, LinkedIn, Threads. And again, thank you for being with us today, and I hope that you have a wonderful continuation to your day. Thank you.